Welcome to the Big Bass Podcast, the fishing show where size matters. I'm Ken Duke.
And I'm Terry Battisti. Our producer and engineer is Nathan Benson.
If you're a regular viewer or listener to the Big Bass Podcast, you know how much we love record fish. And not just the current records, but also the old records, or even fish that should have been records.
And this is one of those stories. It's about a mostly forgotten world record that came along at a pretty interesting time in big bass history.
But because of the controversy that came before it, and the fact that it stood as the record for just a handful of years, very little is known about this fish.
Yeah, so we're going to fill in as many of those gaps as we can and give a clearer look at Owen Smith's 1950 world record smallmouth bass that still stands as the Alabama state record and is still one of the biggest smallmouth bass ever certified.
Terry, let me set the stage for you here. Let's talk about some of the oldest smallmouth records that we've been able to track down. And the first of those, the first reference I have to a really giant smallmouth as being perhaps the biggest out there, was from Henshall's second book. James Henshall's second book was called More About the Black Bass. It was published in 1889, and he references a fish that weighed 8 pounds, 10 ounces, caught in New York, probably in the 1870s or 80s. And that is the first reference I've been able to find about a giant bass that was kind of supposed to be the top end of what a smallmouth could be. Then, in early 20th century, depending on your source, it's either 1906 or 1916, a guy named William Schumacher in Long Lake near Sheboygan, Michigan, caught a fish that weighed 9 pounds, 4 ounces when it was finally put on certified scales. There were claims that it weighed 10 pounds originally, and 5 hours later it weighed 9, 12, and finally, when they got it to some certified scales, it was down to 9, 4. But in 1938, the Federal Bureau of Fisheries said it was the largest smallmouth they had ever recorded. So that gives it a little bit of provenance right there. And then, Terry, 1916, we get to one of my favorite characters and record fish hoaxes in all of history.
Yeah, we got Dr. G.T. McGraw. He starts out, he's a physician. And this character enters a 36-inch, 16-pound smallmouth bass in the Field and Stream fishing contest.
Yeah, I did a deep dive on G.T. McGraw, and I found out a lot about him just before we started recording this show. His name was George T. McGraw, and McGraw was an interesting guy because he was a respected physician in Pennsylvania. And so when he submitted this claimed catch to Field and Stream, they were not quick to just dismiss him. They didn't want to just blow him off as the nut job he obviously was, but what he had done was he included a photo of the fish with his application, but the photo had clearly been manipulated. Best as Field and Stream could figure, he took a large picture of a fish, cut it out, pasted it over a picture of him holding a much smaller fish, and then took a photograph of that. And that was his submission. Terry, he claimed that it took an eternity to land this fish.
Yeah.
Tell everybody about that. A couple of his twisted claims.
So he claims it took 1 hour and 20 minutes to land this fish. And then at one point, it pulled out 170 yards of line on his 200-yard capacity reel. And the math that doesn't settle here is that he caught this in a 1-acre pond. So that pond was either 3 feet wide and 300 yards long. There's just no way that this could have happened at all.
Field and Stream actually spent the better part of a year investigating his claim and looking at that photo. They had it analyzed by photography experts of the day. Remember, this is 1916.
Yeah.
They had mathematical experts take a look at this fish, but eventually they disqualified him. And in his final letter to Field and Stream regarding his catch, he said, "Convince a mule against his will, and he will remain of the same opinion still." This guy was highly pissed off. But apparently a well-regarded physician, and I think it was a town called Avondale, Pennsylvania. Now, the prize package you could win back then, if you won the Field and Stream contest for smallmouth bass, was $32.85 is what it was worth, or about $900 today. But I do not know why George T. McGraw does not have the world record smallmouth to this day with his 16-pounder. Sounds perfectly reasonable to me.
I wonder who, Harden was from Pennsylvania too, so.
That's right. Yeah. Hey, folks, check out our episode on Walter Harden. We'll put the link up here so you can see it. But Walter Harden, who held the world record for smallmouth bass for several years back in the 1930s and 40s with a 14-pound smallmouth bass from, of all places, Terry, the great state of
Pennsylvania.
No.
Oh, Florida. Excuse me. I was daydreaming there for a second.
You gotta stay awake.
With smallmouth, you gotta stay with it. Yeah, I know.
I'm keeping the pace going here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now in 1926, 10 years after McGraw, you have the earliest reference I can find to a world record. Okay. And that came in the issue of Field and Stream magazine, March 1926, where the writer says Mr. William Muir broke the record with a fish that weighed 9 pounds 1 ounce. Okay, so now we got a realistic number.
Yep.
Yeah, a very respectable fish, a fish of thousands and thousands of lifetimes at 9.1. But then in the 30s, all hell breaks loose, and we've already alluded to a little bit. We call this the Florida fiasco, because suddenly the way biologists
isn't that Florida's mantra?
Well,
The
Florida
Florida
man can create some havoc. I'll give you that. But what happened was, these fish have to be defined. Whether you're a layperson like me and Terry when it comes to fish biology, or you're an ichthyologist, you've got to have a way to define these fish. And you and I, Terry, we look at a smallmouth bass, we expect it to be kind of a bronze color. We expect the jawline to hinge in front of the eye. We expect some colored scales on the belly area where you don't get with a largemouth or a spot. Or so much with a spot. We have an idea on how to eyeball this fish and tell what it is. But for the true ichthyologists in the world, they've got to have something that's perhaps even more definitive than just a basic at a distance eyeball test. And before DNA, smallmouth bass was defined by a series of physical characteristics like lateral line, like the number of scales along the lateral line, or the number of rows of scales on the cheek of the fish, or even the number of spiny dorsal rays. And where the problem came in was when people realized, hey, a lot of these same parameters that define smallmouth bass are also true of the Florida largemouth bass.
Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing is that one of our viewers, and I'm going to mess up his last name, Paul Irizarry, I believe.
Yeah,
is how
Paul.
you pronounce
Sure.
his. He actually sent me a picture of a largemouth that he caught in Florida that I swear was the color of a smallmouth bass. So I take back, living in that tannic water, sometimes they're going to get a brownish tint to them, a largemouth. He sent me a picture of a fish that he caught and said, "What does this look like to you?" I said, "It looks like a largemouth that's dressing up as a smallmouth. It's identifying as a smallmouth." So
it's got to happen in the fish world too now. It's 2024.
Exactly.
But here's the other interesting thing about this that led to more confusion, because even biologists were confused at this point about the distinction between largemouth and smallmouth. And you had trained biologists identifying Florida largemouth bass as smallmouth bass.
Yeah.
It was chaotic. Now, were Florida smallmouth bass a possibility? I'm going to say yes, at least sort of. And I say that because smallmouth bass had been stocked in Central Florida, around Tallahassee, around Tampa, also as early as 1908.
Yep.
And even though the record fish that were allegedly coming out of Florida, the record smallmouths, did not come from any of the waters where they had been stocked, a lot of people believe that these fish were traveling through underground rivers. Sinkholes,
rivers.
Yeah. And were then popping up in new lakes that they hadn't been planted in. So, beginning in the 30s, you got multiple Florida bass being recognized as world record smallmouth. And by 1933, you've got a 14-pound Florida bass being called the world record smallmouth. And it's just a total mess. You've got writers talking about how, hey, if the next record is going to be caught, it's going to be caught in Florida.
Yeah.
And then finally, some sense comes along in 1949, Terry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's Hubbs and Bailey to the rescue. You've got Carl Hubbs and Reeve Bailey, two of the most noted and even today ichthyologists when it comes to being experts on the black bass. They not only identified the Florida bass as a different strain, they identified spotted bass, and I mean, heck, Hubbs ran the Scripps Institute out in San Diego or La Jolla, California for decades, a long time. I mean, he was the man when it came to, naming fish, and I think he's got over 50 fish that he named, which is an unbelievable career in fisheries.
Hubbs and Bailey are two of the all-time greats when it comes to fisheries biology, but especially, because I'm biased, I think Terry's biased, especially black bass biology. So we're huge fans of Hubbs and Bailey. The fact that they're not in the Bass Fishing Hall of Fame, one of many tragedies. But finally, after Hubbs and Bailey published their scientific paper on the black basses of Florida, and they say, hey, there are no smallmouth here, forget about that. Get them out of the record book. Finally, things are on a more normal path. And by 1950, there's kind of a clean slate in the world of record smallmouth bass. Field and Stream, which was the record-keeping authority of that time, really the record-keeping authority in the bass world from about 1911, or certainly the early 20s, until they stopped keeping freshwater records in the late 70s. In 1950, they published their list of world record fish, and under smallmouth bass, it says, no authentic record for this species. They said, hey, we're wiping the slate clean, we're starting over.
Yeah.
And they got lucky. There were a bunch of smallmouth bass in their records from before that they could have adopted and called the new world record. They chose not to. And 5 months after that May issue where they said there is no record, Owen Smith catches a big smallmouth. Yeah. But before we get into that too much, let's talk about, they had some other options, Terry. They could have gone with some 11+ pound fish out of Georgia, out of California, but they didn't.
I want to mention this California fish real quick.
Yeah.
Because Round Valley Lake produced an 11-pound even fish, smallmouth supposedly. That is the same Round Valley Lake that had the 14-pound largemouth record. Which is really interesting. And that lake is in Northern California. It had a trout population in it. They were stocking trout in that lake, which to me is how they produced a 14-pound northern strain largemouth. This 11-pound smallmouth, it's possible. Just thinking outside the box. Anyway.
There you go. Well, that allegedly happened in 1945, the 11-pound smallmouth. But that was kind of in the midst of all the problems about defining what a smallmouth bass was. But then Owen Smith comes along in 1950. And I want to talk a little bit about Owen Smith because Terry has to suffer through all my biographical dives into these people. But I get a kick out of learning more about the angler himself.
What was his great-grandfather's name?
Okay, so Owen Smith was born. I don't often go that deep unless I see a really good reason for it. But I will tell you how old his mom lived to be. How about that?
That's pretty impressive.
Owen Ferguson Smith was born in 1901 in a little town called Bedford, Alabama. He had 5 sisters, a half-sister, a couple of brothers. His dad was a farmer. Owen completed 2 years of high school. And according to the 1930 census, when Owen was 28 years old, he was working as a fireman for the city of Fairfield, Alabama. In 1939, he married Doris Bell Daly, also of Fairview. They'd go on to have a couple of daughters. According to the 1940 census, when Owen Smith was 38 years old, he was working as a machinist in a steel mill. According to his draft card, man, you can get some cool information off a draft card, Terry. Smith was 6 feet tall. He weighed 195 pounds, hazel eyes, brown hair, ruddy complexion, all-American boy there. According to the 1950 census, when he was 48 years old, still working as a machinist at a steel mill. He was a member of the Fairfield First Baptist Church and a Fairfield Masonic Lodge member. He died in 1962 in Birmingham. He was survived by all 8 of his brothers and sisters and both of his parents. His dad lived to be almost 90. His mom lived to be 103.
Wow.
He's buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Birmingham. Stop by, pay your respects. This man held the world record. Now let's get into the catch, Terry. We know enough about Owen Smith now. We know enough.
All right. So he catches the fish in the tail race of Wheeler Dam on the Tennessee River between Lauderdale and Lawrence counties. Of course, that dam impounds Wheeler Lake, and below it, I believe, is Pickwick. The weather was, a low of 55, a high of 75, wind up to 18. And then the fish itself weighed 10 pounds, 8 ounces. It was 22.5 inches long and 21.25 inches in girth. It was a square, a box.
It was a box. Now, the girth is what's impressive there to me, Terry.
Yeah.
Not the length. The length doesn't sound like a 10-pound fish to me. But do you think that girth makes up for it? And of course, my general attitude towards smallmouth is if I'm looking at a smallmouth and a largemouth that are the same proportions, I tend to believe the smallmouth's heavier. They just seem more dense on some level.
Yeah, I think that those measurements could definitely be because the girth is really what defines how heavy that fish is. And if this fish, was caught at the right time of year, it had been feeding big time, it could, its mass increases by a square the more the girth is. So, you increase by an inch instead of it being linear, it's a square mathematically. So yeah, those measurements could possibly be a 10.5-pound fish. So the
Very
gear,
impressive.
What did he catch it on, Ken?
Well, he was using a true temper rod, very common for the day, a fluger reel, Ashaway line, and his bait's interesting. And of course, you go back that far. You go back to 1950. Now more than 70 years ago, a lot of baits are going to pop up that folks are not familiar with. But a name they're familiar with is Hildebrandt. And Hildebrandt we know primarily for things like the blades. They're classic blades that everybody loves, and the snagless Sally and stuff like that. He caught on a Hildebrandt spinner combined with a Tex streamer. Now, what that means, and Terry knows this better than me, he's a much better lure expert than I'll ever be, but imagine just an inline straight spinner, but instead of a skirt on it or some sort of soft plastic trailer like we might use today, it looked for all the world like a fly or a little jig on the back end. That's what the Tex streamer would have been. Is that a fair assessment, Terry?
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
And,
It was essentially just a wire that had probably some beads and one or two blades on it, and then at the back you would attach a fly to it. That was it, And that fly, who knows how big it was or what? But no, that's a perfect example of what it was.
yeah, inline spinners. Well, they still catch fish. I still throw inline spinners occasionally. I'll still throw a Snagless Sally. So I'm still throwing essentially a Hildebrandt spinner, just a slightly different and more recognized version than what
one of Bernie Schultz's sponsors for the last 30 years.
Bernie has worked with Hildebrandt a lot, and he created a spinnerbait called the Tin Roller. Not nearly 70 years ago, in case anybody's wondering. But the Tin Roller is a terrific spinnerbait that does not use any lead at all in it. So Smith had terrific credentials. He won the 1950 Field and Stream fishing contest in the smallmouth bass category, and of course, that's exactly what got him in their spotlight. They were looking for somebody to fill that hole. Walter Harden's 14-pound largemouth that wasn't a smallmouth had been DQ'd. They didn't want to go back and take a chance on these 11-pound fish out of Georgia, which didn't seem quite right, or California, which they're worried about that. So they decided what's that?
Can't trust the Californians.
Well, the Californians said it, so the Floridian didn't have to.
Exactly.
So they've got a great fish, a 10.5-pound fish to hang the new world record on. That's perfect. That's perfect until something bigger comes along. So Owen Smith, you're not only our contest winner, you have the world record now. And to win the contest back then, Terry, you'd have had to have a photo. Now, I can't find a photo of Owen Smith with this fish. I can't find one, but there was one. And I'm not going to give up. I mean, I'll hopefully eventually track one down. But he caught this fish. He had to have submitted a photo to win the contest. He had to have submitted a sworn affidavit. He had to submit length and girth measurements. That's where these length and girth measurements are coming from that we just shared with you. He had to have two people sign and witness the document saying that they saw the weighing and measuring of the fish. So Field and Stream standards back then were as good or better than any state in the country. And they called his catch a world record. Does that give you confidence in it?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it like we've said repeatedly, throughout our shows. I mean, the Field and Stream. I mean, hell, we just talked about them not accepting a 16-pound smallmouth, and that they hired mathematicians and photo experts to go through that painstakingly for a year before they DQ'd the guy. I mean, they DQ'd him, but they never really accepted it anyway. So yeah, it kind of tells you how stringent they were and how serious they were about their records and their record keeping.
Yet this was an era, 1950, when Field and Stream, I think, decided to take their record keeping to a new level. They had been kind of a little bit embarrassed by the smallmouth controversies of the 30s and 40s. They started this whole fishing contest as a marketing tool. They started it in 1911 just to get more people interested in the magazine, get more people reading the magazine, paying attention to the stories. It gave them content to work with. So it was a brilliant play that lasted more than 60 years. And whenever every year they would put out an issue, usually in March or April, where they would talk about the new world records that had been set as a result of their contest. They would talk about the prizes that they would award. They would have a form in the magazine, every issue, that people would fill out and submit. And I think about that, and I think about, my God, how much I would love to have those files in my hands, if only to scan some of those documents. Can you imagine scanning the documents from David Hayes or Fritz Friebel or George Perry or Owen Smith.
Yeah.
I want to see that stuff because those are some of the best and most meticulous records out there. But Owen Smith's time in the spotlight, Terry, it didn't last forever. It started in 1950.
Like 5 years.
5 years later, he's old news. What happened?
Yep. Well, David Hayes on July 9th, 1955, fishing Dale Hollow in Tennessee here, smashes the record.
Sure did. Yeah, 11
half.
pounds, 15 ounces out of Dale Hollow,
Yep.
which is clearly the most legendary trophy smallmouth producer the world has ever seen. Dale Hollow has held that record since 1955, but it hasn't always been Hayes. Hasn't always been Hayes, but it's always been Dale Hollow. We'll get to that in another show that you'll be able to see very soon. So Hayes wins the 1955 Field and Stream contest and is declared the new world record at 11:15, and that's a position that is mostly held since that time. But there is still some good news for the late Owen Smith, and that is that he still holds the Alabama record.
Exactly. Yeah, he's held it for 73 years. And it's really sad because there's been a lot of big and that tail race and that area of the Tennessee River has produced a half a dozen fish in that 10-pound mark. 10-1, 10-2, 9-15, 9-14. Talking to Bill Hunley of
T.H.
Marine.
The late Bill Huntley.
He had fish that were pushing 10 pounds that he told me about. And you don't see those big smallmouth anymore out of that fishery. For what reason, I don't know. But, they still catch a lot of 6 and 7 pounders. But these 8, 9, and 10-pound fish they're gone.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
At 73 years, the Alabama state record smallmouth by Owen F. Smith is the second oldest state smallmouth record in the country. Yeah. It's just about 4 months behind the Wisconsin record smallmouth. And you can check out our story about the Wisconsin record smallmouth. We'll put a link up.
Not just the Wisconsin one, but you can the trilogy of David Hayes. How could you forget that, Ken?
I shouldn't have. I screwed up. Thank you for saving us, Doctor. The Hayes trilogy. We did a 3-episode series on David Hayes and his world record smallmouth bass. Terry, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think that was some of our finest work on the Big Bass Podcast.
It was all you, Ken, you and Nathan. I mean, you guys actually went and sat with David Hayes back in 2010?
And before, yeah. And 2005, 2010, throughout some of those years, yeah.
Got the footage, and that's what made that show.
Well, it wasn't all me and Nathan, although honestly, the Big Bass Podcast is mostly Nathan. But that was all of us, because we put those 3 shows together. We talked about it. We analyzed it. We broke it all down. And if you don't like our trilogy on David Hayes, hey, man, you're just not going to like the Big Bass Podcast. You'll learn something at the end of episode 3 that very few people know about that catch.
Yep.
Anyway, all right, Dr. Battisti, your takeaway on Owen F. Smith and his former world record smallmouth bass, and still, to this day, the Alabama state record smallmouth bass.
Legit. It had to have been legit in order for Field and Stream and I really don't think Field and Stream was saving face. I don't think they did anything. They were told by biologists that this was a smallmouth, but they needed to do something to set the record straight, and they dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's on the verification of that fish.
They sure did. I'm right there with you. I think Alabama should be very proud. It's one of a handful of states that has a smallmouth bass record over 10 pounds. You know, you're really talking Tennessee, Kentucky. There's not a lot of places with 10-pound smallmouth bass, and to have one is really, really special in that record bass world. And Owen Smith, Field and Stream was very lucky he came along, because if not for him, that record might have set at an embarrassingly low mark for 4 or 5 years until David Hayes came along and frankly blew it out of the water. I'll be surprised if the record for smallmouth bass is broken in my lifetime. I get a lot of emails telling me it's about to go down. Yep. I'm not a believer.
And I'm just the opposite. I think it's going to get broken before Ken dies.
Maybe it means I'm going to live a long time. I'll take it. All right, Dr. Battisti, can you drive us home?
Yes, sir. It's time to slam the door on this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. Thank you for joining us. We know your time is precious, and we appreciate you spending some of it with us. If you enjoyed the show, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. And if you could do us a big favor, please recommend the show to one of your friends. Just one. If you do that, we double our viewership. It's, it sounds like a little bit, but it actually does a lot for us. If you're a Big Bass junkie, check out the website at thebigbasspodcast.com. You'll find Big Bass Podcast Calculator, good for all largemouth over 14.5 pounds. And we have lists of the state record largemouth, smallmouth, and spots. If you'd like to contact us via email, hit us up at ken@bigbasspodcast.com, terry@thebigbasspodcast.com, and nathan@thebigbasspodcast.com. Please join us again soon, and we'll bring you another story about another big bass that you will not and cannot find anywhere else. And remember,
size matters.